The loud slam of the front door echoed oddly in the stillness of our quiet street. I turned to my husband, searching for an explanation, but all I received was that same familiar smile I had seen countless times before. We were meant to be enjoying a simple evening at home, or at least that's what I envisioned as I finished my shift, utterly drained and yearning for the weekend. Yet here I was, standing in front of a stranger's house, completely clueless about the reason for our visit. "Trust me," he reassured, his hand resting lightly on my lower back as he led me toward the entrance. The house was small and tucked away in a part of the city that felt foreign to me, and an unsettling vibe hung in the air. The porch light flickered dimly, casting just enough illumination to reveal the peeling paint on the door. I should have spoken up. I should have asked him what we were doing here, but for some reason the words failed me. We had been married for 6 years, long enough to find comfort in one another's presence, the cadence of our daily lives. Lately, though, something had shifted. A subtle distance had crept in, like a thread slowly unraveling that neither of us dared to acknowledge. So when he mentioned spending time with his friends that evening, I assumed this was his attempt to reconnect. I pushed my doubts aside and stepped into the house. The first thing that struck me was the silence. There was no music playing, no chatter filling the space, just the soft hum of the refrigerator emanating from the kitchen. 3 men stood in the living room, each holding a drink, their gazes darting toward me as I walked in. I didn't recognize any of them, yet their stares made me feel exposed, like I was under a spotlight in a dimly lit room. "Hey, you made it!" one of them called out, stepping forward. He was tall, with a friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. My husband acknowledged him with a nod, as if this entire situation were perfectly ordinary, but I could feel a tension knotting in my chest. I forced a smile, trying to match the casual atmosphere. "Yeah, we're here." They offered me a drink, which I accepted automatically, needing something to occupy my hands. My husband easily slipped into conversation, joking about something I couldn't quite hear. I stood there, feeling like an outsider, sipping my drink slowly and questioning why I felt so uneasy. Everything about this felt orchestrated. How my husband navigated the room, his relaxed demeanor, his ease with these men, and the way they stole glances in my direction, yet never held my gaze long enough. Just enough to make me feel like the only one who was out of the loop. I wanted to ask him what we were doing here, why he had brought me out when all I craved was the comfort of home. But the words wouldn't come. There was an energy in the room, subtle yet palpable, hinting that I wouldn't like the answer if I asked. So I kept silent, watching them laugh and trying to shake off the unsettling sensation gnawing at me. One of the men, the one with the easy smile, approached me, his gaze lingering a moment too long on my face. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low, sending an involuntary shiver down my spine. I nodded, forcing another smile, but I could feel my heart racing. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't move, standing uncomfortably close. "It's all right. You'll feel better soon." Before I could respond, my husband stepped in, clapping a hand on the man's shoulder and drawing him back into the conversation. I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. What was going on? The night stretched on, each minute dragging longer than the last. I felt trapped, caught between the need to be polite and an instinct I didn't want to heed. I kept convincing myself that I was overreacting, that I was misinterpreting the situation, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a casual gathering. At one point, my husband caught my eye from across the room, and for the first time that evening, I noticed something unsettling in his expression. It wasn't concern or affection. It was curiosity, as if he were watching me to gauge my reaction. I swallowed hard, tightening my grip around the glass in my hand. A chill ran through me despite the warmth enveloping us. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice smooth and calm yet distant. I nodded once more, but deep down I knew he didn't believe me, and I didn't trust myself either. The tension was thickening, suffocating. I could feel it in the way the men moved around me, in my husband's unwavering smile that never softened, even as his eyes remained cold. I should have made an excuse to leave, claimed I wasn't feeling well, anything to escape that house. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. The air was heavy with unspoken words, and all I could think was that I had no idea what was about to unfold. The chill from the outside lingered in the room, despite the heat of the bodies surrounding me. I perched on the edge of the couch, tucking my legs close as if to make myself smaller. My husband was engaged in conversation with one of the men, laughing over something that I couldn't quite catch. Everything felt surreal, as if I were watching through a fogged window. Then it happened. A moment so quiet and subtle that it almost slipped by unnoticed. One of the other men, with dark eyes and a gravelly voice, leaned over from the armchair facing me. His hand brushed lightly against my arm as he passed me a drink, and before I could process what was happening, he kissed me on the cheek. The gesture was quick, almost innocent. Something you might expect from an old friend or a long-lost cousin. But it wasn't innocent at all. My heart raced, but I forced a smile, glancing at my husband. Surely he must have seen that. He had to have noticed. Yet he didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't scowl. He continued his conversation as if nothing had happened. It was as if it were perfectly normal for his friend to lean in that closely to me, to kiss me out of the blue. It was then that I understood this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a spontaneous gathering of friends. It was something meticulously planned, something intentional. The knot in my stomach tightened. I needed to say something to make it clear that this was unacceptable, that I felt uncomfortable. Yet the words stuck in my throat like thick syrup. I scanned the room looking for an ally, someone who could recognize how wrong this all felt. But the other men appeared oblivious, or worse, they were complicit. I placed my drink down on the table untouched, my hands trembling. The man who had kissed me wore a slow, sly smile, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. There was something about him, a way he carried himself, that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't tell if he was pushing boundaries or simply enjoying the game. Either way, I refused to participate. I stood up, needing to move, to do something that reminded me I still had control. I made my way across the room toward the narrow hallway that led to the kitchen. My breaths were shallow, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. I just needed a moment, a split second to collect my thoughts and understand what on earth was happening. As I stepped into the kitchen, I heard footsteps trailing behind me. I turned, half expecting my husband, but instead it was the man from the armchair, the one who had kissed me. He leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, watching me intently. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, nearly a whisper. I nodded, but it felt dishonest. "Yeah, just needed some air." He took a step closer, moving slowly, deliberately. "It's just a kiss. No big deal." My stomach twisted. There was something unnerving in his tone, something that felt premeditated. I forced myself to maintain eye contact, even though every instinct screamed at me to look away, to flee. "I don't think that's appropriate," I managed, my voice slightly trembling. His smile widened, but it lacked warmth. "You didn't seem to mind." Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, enough for me to feel his presence and his breath on my skin. My heart raced, but I remained rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mix of fear and confusion. I wanted to shove him away, to call out for my husband to intervene, but my body refused to move. Deep down, I questioned whether my husband would even care. That realization hit me harder than anything else. He had witnessed the kiss, the way his friend was now standing far too close. And yet he hadn't lifted a finger to stop it. He hadn't uttered a word. He hadn't even glanced my way. Was this what he wanted? Was this part of his plan? I took a shaky breath, stepping back just enough to break his gaze. I needed to think, to unravel what was truly unfolding here. I couldn't confront him, not yet. Not when I didn't understand the rules of this game. The man held my gaze for a moment longer before, without a word, he turned and sauntered back into the living room, leaving me alone in the kitchen, my heart racing in my chest. I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge tightly, trying to steady myself. What was happening? How had I ended up in this house, surrounded by unfamiliar faces in a situation I didn't comprehend? I replayed the moment my husband had suggested coming here. He had seemed so casual about it, so confident I would agree, and I hadn't questioned it. I hadn't pushed back. I had placed my trust in him. But now I was filled with doubt. I pushed myself off the counter, wiping my clammy palms on my jeans. I couldn't remain in the kitchen indefinitely. I needed to face whatever awaited me. Yet as I stepped back into the hallway, the sensation of stepping into something I wasn't prepared for lingered. Re-entering the living room, my heart was still racing from the tension of the kitchen. But the men were deep in laughter, engaged in conversation while my husband lounged on the couch, wearing that familiar relaxed smile. He glanced up at me, but there was no hint of concern in his eyes, nothing to suggest he had any idea about my unease. His calmness, his detachment, unnerved me more than I cared to admit. I quietly sat beside him, forcing a smile to mirror his. I didn't want to create a scene, not now, not when I didn't even know what I would say. The night dragged on, and I concentrated on keeping the conversation light, avoiding eye contact with the man who had cornered me in the kitchen. Suddenly, my husband turned to me with an idea that felt entirely out of place given the night's strange atmosphere. "Hey, how about we go to the water park tomorrow?" he suggested casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "A water park?" I echoed, my surprise evident. It was freezing outside, hardly the season for water slides and wave pools. And why would he propose something so ordinary after everything that had just transpired? "Yeah, I think it would be fun. All of us," he added, gesturing to his 3 friends. "We haven't had a day out together in a while. I think it'd be good for us." I hesitated, the idea feeling absurd after what had just happened. My mind was still reeling from the tension in the house, and now he wanted to act as if nothing had occurred. As if we could just enjoy a carefree day at the water park and forget the awkwardness of the previous evening. A part of me wanted to buy into that idea, to go along with the illusion that everything was perfectly fine. Perhaps this could be our chance to reset, to recapture a sense of normalcy. "I don't know," I started to say, but before I could finish he leaned closer. "Come on, it'll be fun. I promise you'll feel better afterward." Something in his tone eased the doubt that churned within me. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was overthinking the night's events. I slowly nodded, conceding, "All right, the water park it is." The next day we piled into the car, and I found myself wedged between my husband and one of his friends in the back seat. Laughter filled the air during the drive, reminiscent of old friends reliving fond memories after what felt like a long separation. Gradually, the tightness in my stomach began to dissipate, and the tension from the previous night seemed to fade with each mile we traveled. When we arrived, the air was crisp but refreshing, and the vibrant blue slides towered over the entrance like whimsical giants heralding summer fun. It had been years since my last visit to a water park, and as we entered, waves of nostalgia washed over me, evoking memories of simpler times. A small smile crept onto my face. After changing into our swimsuits, we headed toward the lazy river. The men began joking and splashing one another, and I felt myself starting to unwind. The soothing sounds of the water began to calm my frayed nerves. My husband floated beside me, occasionally brushing against me, and for a fleeting moment everything felt just right, like the 2 of us were back to our old selves. We spent the day darting between slides, bursting into laughter as we were drenched by towering waterfalls and racing down chutes at exhilarating speeds. I even found myself screaming with delight as I plummeted down one of the tallest slides, feeling a sense of joy I hadn't permitted myself in ages. To my surprise, I was genuinely having a great time. After a while, we decided to take a breather. We grabbed snacks from a nearby stand and located a shady spot to sit and relax. As I looked around at the group, I felt for the first time like I was truly part of it, not just an observer on the sidelines. One of the men, the one who had kissed me the previous night, caught my eye. He was laughing with the others, and under the bright daylight, surrounded by the day's lightheartedness, he seemed almost harmless. It was odd how a change in setting could alter my perception so drastically. The brightness of day masked the tension from the night before. My husband nudged me playfully. "Having a good time?" This time my smile was genuine. "Yeah, I actually am. See? I told you this would be good for us," he replied, beaming. For the first time in a while, I found myself believing him. As the afternoon rolled on, we made our way to the wave pool, one of our last stops before calling it a day. The water was chilly as we stepped in, but the gentle waves rocked us back and forth in a soothing rhythm. I leaned back, letting the water carry me, eyes closed, as I felt the weight of the last few days slowly slip away. Maybe I had been overthinking everything. Perhaps last night hadn't been as strange as I initially thought. The way my husband had suggested this outing suddenly clicked. He wanted us to reconnect, to reassure me that we were still okay. And maybe, just maybe, we were. By the time we left the water park, the sun was sinking behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the parking lot. My muscles ached from the day's adventures, but it was a satisfying ache, the kind that comes from fun rather than stress. As we drove home, the car was filled with quiet chatter and the comforting hum of the road beneath us. My head rested against the cool window, and I drifted into a peaceful haze. Everything seemed okay, at least for the moment. However, the afterglow of our day out faded far quicker than I had anticipated. The moment we got home, the unease I had tried to push aside began to seep back in. The house felt colder, emptier, and somehow darker than before. The day's joy had created a false sense of peace, and now the walls felt as if they were closing in again. My husband was rummaging through the fridge in the kitchen, looking for a drink. His 3 friends had joined us at home after the water park, their laughter echoing in the living room as they recounted the day's escapades. I leaned against the counter watching him, the light from the fridge casting a strange glow on his face. "Everything okay?" I asked, striving for a casual tone, but my voice betrayed me with a hint of tremor. He turned to me, wearing that same smile, the one that never fully reached his eyes. "Yeah, everything's great. Today was a blast, wasn't it?" I nodded, but the knot in my stomach reappeared. Yeah, it was. That sense of calm I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a heavier, darker feeling. I could sense it thickening in the air with every passing second. The camaraderie from earlier had evaporated, leaving behind the same tension I had felt the night before. Now, with everyone back in the house, it felt even more intense. As if sensing my turmoil, my husband reached across the counter and took my hand in his. His touch was warm and comforting, but it didn't ease the tightness in my chest. Nerves twisted uncomfortably inside me. "Why don't we all just take a break? Maybe watch something?" he suggested, his voice soft yet tinged with an unsettling edge. "Sure," I replied, though I didn't really want to be surrounded by people anymore. I yearned to escape to the bedroom, to shut the door, and be alone with my thoughts. Still, I followed him into the living room, sinking onto the couch between him and one of his friends. The television flickered on, casting a dim light as it displayed some mindless show that barely held my attention. Instead, I found myself watching the men, noting the furtive glances they exchanged and how their conversation dipped to low murmurs. My husband leaned back, seemingly lost in his own thoughts, his arm draped casually over my shoulder. What should have been a comforting gesture felt more like a prison. The man sitting closest to me, the one who had kissed me in the kitchen the previous night, shifted in my direction. I could sense the warmth radiating from him, even though he wasn't touching me, and my pulse raced. His proximity unsettled me more than ever. I glanced at my husband, hoping he would acknowledge the discomfort I was sure was evident on my face. But he didn't. His attention remained glued to the screen, a faint smile lingering on his lips. Suddenly, the man leaned in closer, his breath warm against my ear. "You had a good time today, didn't you?" he whispered, sending chills coursing down my spine. I forced a smile and nodded slightly, trying to maintain some semblance of peace. "Yeah, it was fun." He returned my smile, but his gaze lingered on me a moment too long, searching for something in my expression that I couldn't articulate. Unable to hold his stare any longer, I redirected my attention to the TV, hoping that would signal the end of whatever game he was playing. But then I felt it. His hand brushed against my leg, lingering just a beat too long. Panic surged through me, and before I could react, I caught my husband glancing over. He had to have seen it. Yet, once again, he remained silent, his expression unchanged, his body relaxed as if nothing was amiss. But everything was far from okay. I shifted slightly, trying to create distance between myself and the man, but the sense of impending chaos only grew stronger. The room felt increasingly claustrophobic, the air thick and suffocating. I struggled to breathe, unsure of what was happening, but instinctively knowing that I didn't like it. I needed to escape. "I'm just going to grab some water," I mumbled, standing abruptly. No one tried to stop me as I made my way back to the kitchen, my mind racing. I leaned against the counter, taking deep, shaky breaths to calm the storm inside me. The sounds of laughter and quiet chatter from the living room drifted through the walls, but I couldn't concentrate on it. All I could think about was my husband's expression, the way he had done nothing, as if all of this were perfectly normal. Was this what he truly wanted? Had he been hinting at something all along? I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning pale. This wasn't right, none of it felt right. But I felt powerless to stop it. I didn't know how to confront him or his friends without feeling like I was the one making a mountain out of a molehill. Perhaps I had been too passive, allowing all of this to unfold without asserting myself, without establishing the boundaries that should have been clear from the start. Just then, the sound of footsteps pulled me from my spiraling thoughts. I turned to see my husband standing in the doorway. His eyes held a softness that seemed distant, as if he sensed my discomfort but didn't know how to address it. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. I longed to tell him everything, the man's inappropriate touch, the way I felt like I was losing control of my surroundings. But when I opened my mouth, no words came. All I could manage was, "I'm fine." He approached me gently, placing his hands on my shoulders. "We're all just having a good time. You're overthinking it." His attempt at reassurance only made me feel smaller, more uncertain. I forced a nod, trying to convince myself. "Yeah, maybe." He smiled again, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "Come back to the living room when you're ready. You'll feel better." As he walked away, I stood alone in the dim kitchen, grappling with the mess everything had become. I questioned my ability to trust him, and even more so, I questioned myself. Watching him disappear into the hallway, I felt a sinking dread settle in. Whatever lay ahead, I wasn't prepared for it. That night, sleep was elusive. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. My husband lay beside me, his breathing deep and steady, already lost to slumber. I turned onto my side, facing away from him, but no matter how hard I tried to quiet my mind, the worries kept flooding back. The way he watched me, the man's unwelcome touch, and most distressingly, my own silence. What was happening to us? The next morning dawned quietly, too quietly. I could hear soft voices drifting from the living room, but I lingered in bed, reluctant to face the day. My husband eventually got up, leaving me alone in the dimness of the bedroom. I stared at the wall, my mind racing through the events of the past few days. I had allowed this situation to spiral out of control, and now it felt as though I was trapped in a web I couldn't escape. I didn't even know how to confront him anymore. Eventually, I forced myself out of bed. The kitchen was empty, but I could hear my husband and his friends outside on the patio, their laughter filtering through the open window. I leaned against the counter, straining to catch snippets of their conversation. It was the same as ever, light-hearted and casual, as if nothing had changed, as if everything was perfectly normal. But it felt anything but normal to me. I couldn't shake the premonition that something significant was about to occur, something that would push me past my breaking point. It wasn't just the subtle touches or the way they looked at me. It was a sense of foreboding, a gnawing instinct that warned me to brace myself for what lay ahead. It was the way my husband seemed completely unfazed, as if everything was perfectly fine. He acted like he hadn't noticed the shift in our relationship, or perhaps he had and simply didn't care. That thought sent a tightening sensation through my chest. As the day dragged on, the tension only intensified. The men remained outside, laughing and joking while I lingered in the kitchen, feeling more isolated than ever. My mind replayed everything like a broken record. The way my husband had suggested spending time with his friends, the way he observed me, as if anticipating something. What was he waiting for? I could no longer stand it. I needed answers. I needed to confront him and make him understand how I felt. Yet as I approached the patio door, my legs felt heavy, as if they were made of lead. I paused for a moment, watching him through the glass, laughing with his friends. They looked so relaxed, so at ease. I didn't belong in that scene. But I had to act. Ignoring the rising dread in my chest was no longer an option. Taking a deep breath, I slid the door open and stepped outside. Their laughter quieted as they noticed my presence, and my husband turned to me with that same easy smile. "Everything okay?" he asked, but his eyes hinted that he already knew the answer. I stared at him, my heart racing, the words caught in my throat, unable to escape. The weight of it all, the doubt, the fear, the betrayal, felt suffocating. I stood frozen on the patio, the cool air brushing against my skin as his question hung heavily between us. "Everything okay?" he repeated, that same smile plastered on his face, oblivious to the cracks that were beginning to show. Or maybe he was aware and just didn't care. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words failed me. Silence enveloped us, thick with the tension that had been building for days. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter fading as they sensed the shift in the atmosphere. I needed to voice my concerns, to make him understand that everything had changed. But all I could hear were the echoes of the past few days, the strange touches, the furtive glances, the moments that felt wrong yet went unacknowledged. And his silence, always his silence. I began, my voice trembling and barely audible, my throat constricted, and my chest felt as though it might cave in under the weight of everything I had held back for so long. He stood there, waiting, but the smile faded from his face, replaced by a look of concern that felt calculated, almost too late. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer, but I instinctively took a step back, my mind racing. "I don't know who you are anymore," I whispered, the words tumbling out. "I don't know what this is, what you've turned us into." He blinked, momentarily taken aback, but remained silent. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as my heart pounded in my ears, waiting for him to respond, hoping for something that would make sense of this chaos. But nothing came. His friends shifted uncomfortably, sensing the growing tension, but I couldn't focus on them. All I could see was him, the man I thought I knew, now a stranger standing before me. "What are you talking about?" he finally asked, his voice low and controlled, perhaps too controlled. "I'm talking about this." I gestured around us, my hands shaking. "All of this. The way you've been watching me, the way you've let them." I faltered, my voice cracking. I couldn't finish the sentence. He stared at me, his expression inscrutable, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition, guilt, something. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by that same calm demeanor, as if nothing was amiss. "You're overreacting," he said, his voice soft yet firm, as if speaking to a child who didn't grasp the rules of the game. And maybe I didn't. Perhaps that was the problem. I shook my head, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "No, I'm not. You've changed. We've changed. I don't feel safe anymore. Not with you. Not here." The words hung in the air, heavy and definitive. He didn't move, he didn't react. He just stood there, staring at me as if he couldn't recognize the person in front of him. And maybe he couldn't. Perhaps I had changed too. His friends remained silent, watching, but I could no longer focus on them. It was just him and me, standing on the precipice of something I couldn't name. Something that felt like it was slipping away faster than I could grasp. Then in that charged silence, he uttered the words that shattered whatever was left between us. "I thought this was what you wanted." I stared at him, the weight of his words crashing over me like a tidal wave. "What I wanted? No. You can't believe that," I retorted, disbelief washing over me. He had convinced himself that this was part of some unspoken agreement, some twisted fantasy I was supposed to embrace. In that moment I realized he didn't truly know me. The person he thought he could mold and control, she didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady despite the tempest raging inside me. "I can't stay here. Not with you." His expression shifted, the calm facade cracking for the first time. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But there was no conviction behind it. "Ido." I turned and walked back into the house, my legs shaky but resolute. I didn't stop to gather my things. I didn't even glance back. The weight of my decision settled over me as I reached the front door, my hand hovering over the handle before stepping outside. The cold air hit me sharply, the night sky dark above with stars barely visible through the clouds. I paused for a moment, inhaling the crisp night air, feeling the chill seep into my skin. I had no idea what came next or where I would go. But as I walked down the quiet street, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness, I realized something for the first time in a long time. I felt free, and that terrified me more than anything.